Thank you for that kind introduction. I'll have some words about the Markkula Center and the very important work that they do towards the end of my remarks. But I'd like to jump right in and begin with a quotation from today's San Jose Mercury News. You might think that I don't read the San Jose Mercury News because I now am in Southern California. Of course, that would be false. You're always very affectionate towards and remembering of where you started in politics. So the Mercury today carried the following quote. There is apparently a new psychological disorder called election stress disorder. I couldn't have made this up. Quote, most of my ongoing patients in my clinical practice have brought this issue of the election up with discussions of disruptive sleep, increased tension and stress, and feeling despondent, said Tom Plant, psychology professor and director of the Spirituality and Health Institute at Santa Clara University, end quote. So that is our text for tonight's sermon. I intend to discuss 4 subjects, though the fourth will be just in a short moment in closing. First is there a high degree of contentiousness in politics today and in governance? Second, is money an inappropriately heavy influence in today's politics and government? Third, what has gone wrong with our primary system? And then my conclusion, the importance of electing candidates who have a conscience and the role that the Markkula Center plays in preserving and fostering that. So let me begin. Is it true that there is a higher degree of contentiousness in our politics today? And the answer is yes, absolutely. I was first elected to Congress in 1988. The Republicans had been in the minority for 34 years. They stayed in the minority for another 4. And when I became a member of the Republican minority in the House of Representatives, our leader was Bob Michel. And he said, look, you'll never be in the majority, so get along with the other side. Don't demonize the other side. There's always some compromise that you can make. And recognize the tremendous honor it is to sit here where Abraham Lincoln sat, where John Quincy Adams sat, where James Madison sat, in the people's house. That was his message. And 6 years thereafter, the Gingrich Revolution happened. And Newt Gingrich distinguished himself by the comment that the duty of the minority was to become the majority. The duty of the minority is to become the majority. And there's defense for both positions, but I do want to contrast Bob Michel's approach to Newt Gingrich's approach. And Newt then indeed brought about the change. I think that one of the dangers is when you exclude the minority, they can be made to feel not part of the process and thus don't contribute. On the other hand, when every election is a battle for control, the parties tend to take a look at another party's success as their own failure. And indeed, a piece of legislation that's beneficial will help reelect the party in power, and hence, though I might support it, I will be hesitant to support it. That's the danger when you move from they're always going to be in majority, so better get along with them attitude, to whoever can pull the votes next time will be the speaker. There's a huge difference between those two approaches, and I saw that difference happen during my time in politics. Again, I repeat, elected first in 1988, the last Republican majority was 1954. And it wasn't until 1994 that the House turned Republican. Second factor that was going on that caused this change is cable TV. Cable TV has had 2 particular aspects that are malignant. One is you can choose your outlet and you will hear nothing but what reinforces your point of view. MSNBC if you're a Democrat, Fox if you're a Republican. Largely speaking, that's where you go for your news. And I certainly don't believe that the homogenization of news when it was ABC, CBS, and NBC was flawless. But I would have a better shot at getting a broad-based reporting of the news in those days than I do now. I know what I'm going to hear when I turn the channel to 44 or 46 in Southern California, and that has I think been deleterious. And the other aspect of cable TV is that when I first ran for office in 1988, to get on television, one would have to buy TV time in San Francisco. And that, with 12 congressional districts in the broadcast area, was prohibitively expensive, meaning that most congressional campaigns, state Senate campaigns, and assembly campaigns could not buy television time, which meant that you weren't victimized, I should say, by the 30-second attack. What you have now, though, is cable TV offering you the chance to buy the program direct to your district and direct to your primary voters. So if you only want to appeal to Democrats in the 12th Congressional District, you can buy MSNBC for the 12th Congressional District and thereby go after your opponent on issues that will push him or her more towards the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party. And similarly in Orange County, where I now reside, where you might have the converse. And now, at risk of alienating everybody, I will go through a couple of observations as to what this has led to. But I think candor is what's called for at the Markkula Center. On the Democratic side, it's my observation that the public employee unions in California are dominant and that it is not always beneficial. I point to, for example, Governor Brown recently proposed a streamlined system for affordable low and moderate income housing. His idea, and it was torpedoed in the legislature because it did not have a prevailing wage provision. The Democratic Party orthodoxy insisted that no bill could go through without a prevailing wage provision, namely that the union wage would have to prevail. And what cost? Less affordable housing. And it became a matter of orthodoxy for the Democrats in the legislature. Another example is in the year 2000, again, critical of the Democrats. I'll be critical of the Republicans in just a nanosecond. Public employee unions' pensions were automatically adjusted to cost of living with no funding source. So let's take the money coming from the dot-com boom, the capital gains tax in California, and put it into statutory law for adjustments of public employee pension retirement, even though we don't have any way to pay for it. And the third and last example I'll give is the appeal to racial minorities with the prospect of avoiding the possibility of compromise. This happened just a couple of years ago, where there was an effort in the legislature to undo Proposition 209's prohibition of racial preference for admission to the University of California. I happen to believe that racial neutrality is the only morally correct view regarding access to public education. But the racial minority appeal within the Democratic caucus in Sacramento was so strong that it actually was introduced and expected to pass until the Asian American community spoke out against it. Another example, and the last one I have on the Democratic side, is it's okay to say that you want a secure border, but if you say you want a wall, you are a racist. And that is the orthodoxy, and you cannot say the word wall and expect to get out of a Democratic primary. On the Republican side, may I say as a preface that I have a little experience with being primaried on the Republican side. For those of you who don't know my background, I ran twice for the United States Senate, and 3 times for the United States Senate, and I lost in the Republican primary twice. I won one primary and then proceeded to lose to Senator Feinstein. On the Republican side, NRA and gun owners. So I'm running for Senate in 2010. The question comes up at the KTLA, Los Angeles television interview, lightning round. The candidates are there, Carly Fiorina, myself, and Chuck DeVore. Lightning round, so you only have 10 seconds to answer. Should people on the no-fly list be allowed to buy guns? Professor Campbell. And I've seen it many, many times. My answer is, well, no. Like, please, next question. You're kidding. Chuck DeVore. It's my Second Amendment right. I'll have no mindless, faceless bureaucrat denying me of my Second Amendment right. And you look at Carly Fiorina, and she's kind of wondering. It's clear to me she had never thought about it before. And she's going, do I go with the right-wing kook, or do I go with the lefty who's really not a Republican? I know, I'll go with the right-wing kook. So she says, I've got friends on the no-fly list. Just kind of, wow. See, where was WikiLeaks when you needed them to find out? I then made the mistake after the 3 answers. I said, no, wait a minute, just a minute. I can't believe I'm hearing this. You want people who are too dangerous to fly to be able to buy a gun. For heaven's sakes, get off the no-fly list, and then you can buy a gun. But no, in fact, I don't believe I'd be hearing this if it weren't for a Republican primary. And that's what I said, and you can YouTube it if you'd like. I'm proud of that moment, and it cost me the election as much as anything did, because the next week a major buy went out from the Gun Owners of America, NRA supported, and one of those fly-by-night PACs that you never heard of before or ever again in an election, telling gun owners that I was going to take their guns away. I failed to sign the No New Taxes pledge. Why? Actually, in Congress and in the state Senate, I never voted for a tax increase but one, which was an airline ticket tax to pay for heightened security at airports. I think that's a pretty good record. 9 years in the Congress, 2 in the state Senate, 11 years, never voted for a tax increase except for the safety increase in ticket tax. But Dick Morris and Grover Norquist demanded that I sign the No New Tax pledge, or they would send out to their email list an attack that I was a big taxer. I said, no, I don't think I'm ever going to vote for a tax increase, but I'm not going to say never because I don't know the circumstances. What kind of a senator am I going to be if I've taken that issue away? And they were as good as their word, and they did send out an email to all of their extensive list, Grover Norquist and Dick Morris. You might remember the 2008 presidential primary. If not, let me remind you, there was a question early on to the candidates, and the question was, if you could help balance the budget of the United States by getting $10 in expenditure cut for every $1 in taxes, would you agree? And not one would raise his hand. So that's the shibboleth on the Republican side. Those are the things that Republicans are not allowed to say. Other things, you've got to be for prisons rather than parole. You've got to, you can never say Affordable Care Act. It's always Obamacare. Now, what are the solutions to excessive hostility? Largest solution that I have is going to be one I recur to in my second of my 3 main subjects, and that is getting money to be less dominant in politics. But before I do, are there ways of getting hostility to be diminished in the legislative process? And yes, there are. One of them is counterintuitive, and that is to rely on supermajority more often. When I was a state senator, we still required a 2/3 vote for the budget, and that made me more relevant than happens now. Now the members of the legislature can pass the budget with only a majority. And I think it was a fault of Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, that it was passed with only Democratic votes. It kept the major social experiment that it was from having the investment of a bipartisan nature. Medicare, Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act, all had strong Republican and Democratic majorities behind them. It was, I think, dangerous for our country to put forward so major a solution as the Affordable Care Act of Obamacare with the support of only one party. So I would say a few more supermajority rules would not be bad, and that it probably was a mistake for California to take away the 2/3 rule in the legislature because it renders the minority party less able to have positive influence. Another suggestion, and though this is really inside baseball, secret ballots for committee chairs in Congress. See, most junior members of Congress can't stand their committee chairs, whether they're Democratic or Republican. So if you had a secret ballot, you'd elect the more centrist of the party in power. So small suggestion. But third, and one that we've learned in California, we still are learning, is eliminate term limits. Oh my gosh, how can I be a reformer when I'm proposing the elimination of term limits? Well, here's why. We have Senator Becky Morgan here. She was our state senator when the Loma Prieta earthquake hit. The people of California approved a 1-cent sales tax increase for 1 year in order to fund earthquake relief. Why did the legislature vote yes for that proposal? Well, first of all, because Becky Morgan was and is an honorable person. Secondly, there was no term limit. She was going to be there for a long time. You have to remember earthquakes hit north and south both. And then third, Northridge actually did hit a few years later, and the Northern Californians remembered the Southern Californians. But if you have term limits, they're gone. And the person who did the arrangement for you last time isn't there. And you just separate people into those who are there just to get to the next job from those who are there to do good for the state of California. Term limits, however, at least improve things by getting people into office who are less partisan, at least during their last term. Okay, this is the argument. Your last term, You know you're out. You're going to behave in a less partisan fashion. So in my last term, I asked the Library of Congress to do a double-blind study of members of Congress, and you can find this on the Institute of Government webpage at UC Berkeley, Go Bears, where I asked this question: were members of Congress in their last term more likely or less likely to support the majority of bills of their party? So the Congressional Research Service did the research. They got the bills that were party line, largely party line, and the fascinating outcome was members of Congress were less likely to be independent, more likely to be faithful to their party in their last term when they knew they were leaving. So the argument you should have term limits because people will be liberated in their last term is false. They actually become more loyal. Why? Because they're looking to be a lobbyist, for heaven's sake. And you want to be why go to a lobbyist who's a wishy-washy, middle-of-the-road Republican when you can go to somebody who can go and get an appointment to see Newt, just to choose a random example. So I think term limits should go. And then lastly, the value of perspective. I must share with you, Ralph Dills was the most senior member of the legislature when I was a state senator from Los Angeles, first elected in 1940. And perspective. So whenever anything went wrong, Ralph would say, well, it isn't Pearl Harbor. He was there for Pearl Harbor. He was in the California legislature in Pearl Harbor. So the question of perspective is, I think, lost when you kick people out because they have some experience. I want to make an analogy here to the Supreme Court and then move on to the second major subject. But in the Supreme Court, you see the same thing. And I think the Supreme Court is increasingly polarized because we have lost the kind of justice who draws from a common experience. Justice John Paul Stevens and Justice Byron White were both World War II veterans. And they found a lot of commonality, though one was appointed by a Democrat and the other appointed by a Republican, John F. Kennedy and Gerald Ford. That shared experience brought them together. And instead of veterans and looking for a common shared experience in public service, we now appoint law professors to the Supreme Court. Perhaps the mistake first started with cantankerous Felix Frankfurter, appointed from Harvard Law School by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But if you want to just take a look at the current court and see who the justices are, Elena Kagan and Stephen Breyer from the Harvard Law School, and the late Nino Scalia from the University of Chicago Law School. So if you want justices who never see the wisdom of somebody else's point of view, go to the law schools. And I'll conclude by pointing out a curious point of history, which you have to be truly a devotee of the obscure. But one of the more unlikely pairings in the Supreme Court was 1910 to 1914, when Justice Horace Lurton, this may be the only time you ever hear Justice Horace Lurton's name in modern times. Justice Horace Lurton and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes voted together far more than any random pairing would suggest. And you take a look at their history, and I will share with you. In 1910 to 1914, Justice Horace Lurton voted with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes tremendously often. Horace Lurton, Sergeant Major, Tennessee Infantry, Kentucky Cavalry, twice captured in the Civil War. Oliver Wendell Holmes, enlisted man, rose to the ranks of Lieutenant Colonel, Massachusetts Militia, wounded 3 times. These men had experienced the alternative to compromise. And I think that shared value is missing in the Supreme Court today. Number 2, money in politics. It's worse than you think. So here I am giving depressing news. But this is not a secret. I think you should know about it, but it's not gotten much attention. Do you know that members of Congress tithe? I don't mean giving to their church either. If you want a position on a powerful committee, you are obliged to give a certain amount of money to the party, congressional committee of your party. Now, it's true under the Democrats and it's true under the Republicans. This tithing is not widely known. And it's a higher price if you're on Ways and Means Committee that sets the tax laws, a higher price if you're on the Appropriations Committee that spends all of the money. If, like me, you are on the Africa Subcommittee of the International Relations Committee, there was no tithe required. It was not one of the high contribution producing committees. Very few people contributed on the basis of sub-Saharan Africa. More the shame, actually. So the tithing is actually a part of Congress. And so you have to raise the money to give to the party so that you get reappointed to the committee. And if you're a chair of a committee, it's even more. The problem, it seems to me, is frequently misstated as Citizens United. The problem is not Citizens United by itself. The problem is Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976. So let me take you back to the Watergate era, 1974. In the wake of that scandal, Congress passed limits on contributions and limits on spending, both. And the Supreme Court struck down the limits on expenditure. And the famous phrase, "Since then, money is speech," and kept on the limits on contributions. Now, this was a departure, and I want to impress upon you that the standard belief that money is speech, as you hear today, and I think a majority of the Supreme Court would hold today, is of recent creation. The 1907 Congress banned contributions by national banks and corporations. 1959, Congress banned contributions from labor unions. The Supreme Court in 1949, 1965, and 1966 upheld restrictions that states had imposed on campaigning, including the limitations on picketing and parading and using sound trucks. In Buckley versus Vallejo, for the first time, the Supreme Court said limits on spending money are unconstitutional. Before that, the court had always made this distinction. If you want to limit the content of speech, you're running afoul of the First Amendment. But if you're going to limit how speech is made, it's okay. Sound truck, speaking with loudspeakers on weekends, or through a corporate form, the 1907 Act, or the union form, the 1959. In other words, 1976, Buckley versus Vallejo was a departure from settled Supreme Court precedent. And what it did was to create a plutocracy, because there's a limit now on how much you can contribute. That was upheld, but no limit on how much you could spend. So if your name is Rockefeller or Kennedy, to be bipartisan, you have an asymmetric advantage because you can spend your own money. And if your name is Campbell, of which I'm tremendously proud, you need to raise money. That difference has shown itself in politics, right? John Corzine in New Jersey, and at least 2 candidates in the state of California, which discretion prevents me from naming. So here is what Justice White said, dissenting from Buckley versus Vallejo. Justice Thurgood Marshall and Justice Byron White dissented from Buckley versus Vallejo. And it's worth reading because I think this notion that money is speech and you can't touch it should not be so sacred. Pursuant to the undoubted power of Congress, Justice White said, to vindicate the strong public interest in controlling corruption and other undesirable uses of money in connection with election campaigns, Congress concluded that limitations on contributions and expenditures were essential if the aims of the Act were to be achieved. Neither the limitations on contributions nor those on expenditures directly or indirectly purport to control the content of political speech by candidates or by their supporters or their detractors. End quote. Justice White went on to say that if you simply limit how much can be given, which is what was upheld by the Supreme Court, remember they said contribution limits are okay, expenditure limits not. So you have only a certain amount of money you can bring in, but no limit as how much you can spend. He predicted, and is remarkably prescient, that individuals would find ways of giving money to other organizations that would then help the candidate, getting around the contribution limit. And the only way to solve that was to put a limit on how much could be spent in the election, not simply how much you could contribute to the candidate. So years later, Citizens United comes along and says, yes, individuals can give as much as they want. That was Buckley. Well, corporations can give also as much as they want. It can expend, pardon me. Individuals can expend as much as they want. That was Buckley. Corporations can expend as much as they want. That's Citizens United. So, solution. Why not just wait for Citizens United to be reversed? Well, because it won't be reversed, but if it were, it would still be a problem because you'd have the Rockefeller-Kennedy issue of the individual spending her or his own money, And secondly, you'd have the super PAC. So the contribution limit would still be enforced. But instead of calling it a super PAC, we would call it a 527. Or we would call it an association of individuals for, I'm trying to think of the name that did the hit piece on me after the no-fly zone, the no-fly guns vote. It existed for a half-life of a deuterium atom and then disappeared. So think of the tax code, right? There is no limit to human imagination of how to get around the tax code. So also, if you put a limit on how much can be contributed, but not a limit on how much can be spent, there's no limit to what will surface as other ways. And so you give to the super PAC today, you send a note to the candidate, and you say, I want you to know I contributed to the super PAC $150,000. But no corruption there, because I didn't give it to you. And that's absurd. Justice White saw it in his dissent. So I think the problems would remain if you simply have limits on contribution and not limits on expenditure. So my strong suggestion is that we have a limit on expenditure. Furthermore, I'm counting the votes on the Supreme Court, and possibly Sotomayor and possibly Kagan would reverse Buckley versus Vallejo, but none of the others. Not Ginsburg, not Breyer, not Garland, if he becomes the Supreme Court justice. They will accept this long-held statement now that money is speech. The expenditure of money is speech. And so getting a new justice to reverse Citizens United will not reverse Buckley, and that won't solve the problem. Hence, my handout. So at this point, I'll ask the folks in the back to assist. If you did not get a handout, I wanted you to leave with my email address and with one positive suggestion. So this is not a negative presentation, but a positive suggestion of what we can do. Here is the amendment to the Constitution that I think would do it. I'm going to read it and then go on. My reason for raising it is I want to be specific and positive, constructive. How about this amendment to the Constitution? Only a natural person eligible to vote in any election to federal office may spend money or contribute services in connection with a candidate for that election. Period. Pause for a moment. Only a natural person. So that's no corporations, no committees, no unions, natural person. Secondly, notice I'm limiting spending money and contributing services. So it's not unfair to Republicans because Democrats are more likely going to have union walking precincts. So it's both. How do you value walking a precinct? Well, tell me what the prevailing wage is, since there are means of ascertaining that. No such expenditure of money or value of contributed services combined shall exceed $1,000 by any one person. So that's it. If I give it to the committee, if I give it to these 527, if I give half and half, fine, but it's still only $1,000. And you know what's going to happen is the candidate's going to say, please give it to me, and you'll see these other groups fade away. Because the candidate has the best control over how to spend it, and that will be the $1,000. And if you walk precincts for 3 weekends and it works out to $1,000 in contributed time, then that's it. You're not going to be able to give money either. So the idea is deal with expenditure. Except the candidate, and that's obvious because you're giving to the candidate, so the candidate has to spend. But the candidate can spend only what she or he gets. As for whom the limit of expenditure of money or the value of services performed for the election of that candidate shall not exceed the money or services contributed to that candidate. So that's it. Raise the money, and notice, by the way, you have to be eligible to vote in the election. So if you're running for Congress, you've got to raise your money from the people in your congressional district. Can't vote, can't contribute. Right where you ought to be focusing your attention. None of the outside huge volumes of money washing in on the issues that we have all seen. And then I end by saying the states can do the same if they want, and if you need to adjust $1,000 for inflation, go ahead and do so. First of all, is it odd to amend the Constitution, and is it hopeless to think I can do so? It is not odd. My first vote was when I was 19 years old, because the law in Illinois had been 21, and then the Constitution was amended to allow 18-year-old to vote. And here's the history. The 18-year-old vote was proposed in March of 1971. It passed the Congress. It was proposed in December of 1970. It was ratified by 3/4 of the states and became law July 5, 1971, start to finish, 6 months and 2 weeks. Why? Because we were getting draft notices and going off to fight and die without being allowed to vote. And that was so palpably unfair, the people rose up and amended the Constitution. I think we're at that kind of a moment on campaign finance. I hope that you will interpret my views tonight as not partisan, and that I don't have a pro-democratic, a pro-republican, or pro-independent point of view on this. I do think we are at a 18-year-old vote moment, and that a solution of this nature is needed. Why not be simple and just say Congress shall have the right to regulate, thereby overcoming the First Amendment, because we don't have confidence that Congress will do it right. If you think the tax code is a model of perfection. So those are my suggestions. And then lastly, are there problems that I haven't foreseen? Yes, of course, there are problems. By definition, I can't tell you about the problems I haven't foreseen. But one or two that I have foreseen is, so the Mercury News runs a special supplement saying that Joe Simitian should be elected to Congress. A wise thing to do, no doubt. And it's an extra supplement beyond their editorial page. That would probably be an issue that would go to the question of the contribution of that value. But if they simply say, we endorse Joe Simitian for Congress, that would be within their normal editorial rights. So are there close questions? Yes, I can see that. Would there be a William Randolph Hearst problem, where some wealthy person buys a newspaper and then just continually editorializes? Yes, and if you don't think we have it today, turn to MSNBC, turn to Fox. Problem 3, the current nominating process. Now, I'm cognizant of the fact that Democrats might find nothing wrong with the current nominating process, or at least large numbers of Democrats may find nothing wrong. I think there might be some who do. And I'm also cognizant of the fact that many Republicans are supporting Donald Trump, and so I'm not here to debate that. But I do think there is a fair assumption that this is a most unusual season. What was it I read at the beginning about a new stress disorder? It's going into the psychological textbooks because of this election. So what is the problem, and how can it be solved? Well, if there is a problem on the Republican side, it can be solved by changing the rules of the Republican primary. What led to this outcome? Too many candidates competing at the same time for proportionate allocation of delegates. There's 12 people debating. One stands out. That person goes up in the polls, gets 14, 15%, and everybody else gets 3, 4%. And that person then gets 14% of the votes from that state, and you go on and build up. So a solution, if the Republican Party was inclined to do it, would be in the future to limit its presidential debates to no more than 3 people, chosen at random, and if you would want, then have 5 different debates or 4 different debates, and it's just pull out of a hat which of the candidates are, and you have your preliminary screening. I understand you have to be above 1% or whatever the rule was. But remember, the rule that we saw had 12 candidates up there all at the same time with 2 or 3 minutes max, and as I said, one stands out in such an audience. And then another thing which the Republicans could learn from the Democrats if they chose is hold off on allocating delegates early on. Now, this runs contrary to some other sentiments, so I'm not as confident in these suggestions as I am about the constitutional amendment. I'm not putting this on paper and handing it out. But I am suggesting that something along the lines of if you don't get 25%, then you don't get any delegates. And the percentage that is not allocated goes into a pool, and that pool is allocated later on, possibly by superdelegates. That's the way the Democratic Party approached it. And I know there's been some criticism from Senator Sanders supporters about that. More fundamentally, and with this I'm going to conclude the main points of my remarks and then conclude with just some closing comments about individuals of conscience. More generally, this campaign has, clearer than any campaign I have ever seen, brought to the fore what is the purpose of a political party. And I believe it's fair to say there were three. 1, to communicate information about a candidate. 2, to forge legislative coalitions so as to get bills passed. And 3, to facilitate campaign finance. Number 1, to communicate information. No, I suggest to you that the internet has bypassed that. You learn far more and far more accurately my views by going to my website when I was running for office than going to the platform of the Republican Party. Indeed, when I was running, I frequently found myself in the position of saying, what things of the party I disagreed with in order to get my point across, although I agreed with more than I disagreed with by far in the Republican Party. But that first function of communicating information, she has a D after her name, therefore it must be, is false. And it's imperfect, and we have a ready-made alternative. Go look it up. Find the position. There's fact check, there's Ballotpedia, there are many organizations that will give you points of view put up by the candidate themselves. Secondly, to forge legislative coalitions. This has fallen down. Think of the 2012 closure of the government by Senator Cruz over Obamacare, Affordable Care Act. The sense that, well, Mitch McConnell could crack the whip and pull the Republicans in line because they all have an R after their name was belied in the most demonstrable way possible by one single senator who had a different motive and pursued that motive. So if forging legislative coalitions is the goal, the party structure seems to be poorly adapted to it. More likely is if you take me back to the days of no term limits in the California legislature, where people's word was their bond, where you would do an understanding with somebody this year, knowing in 4 years or 5 or 6, you might ask them, and that you had mutual interests, is a much better way to forge legislative coalitions. And much as California derided the fact that we had late budgets when we had a 2/3 rule, I put to you that the latest ever was September, and that was on a July deadline. And by and large, overwhelmingly by and large, we did have budgets on time. And lastly, to facilitate campaign financing, we needed parties because the law after Buckley versus Vallejo said the contribution limits were in place, expenditure limits were not, and you could give more to the party than you could to an individual as part of the 1974 law that Congress passed, thinking it was passing a limit on expenditures as well as a limit on contributions. When you took away the limit on expenditures, you just created a rush to give to the party so that the party could get the back door. And that's why you see these fundraisers today. I saw I won't say who, but there was a fundraiser in Hollywood. Now you can guess which party. And the ticket price apparently was $120,000. Well, I didn't know. You can't give $120,000. But you can if you begin to add up to the Senate committee, to the Congressional committee, to the Committee for a More Reasonable Future, or whatever the name of the group happens to be. So I think we're at a divergent point. Money in politics is, because of the Supreme Court, uncontrolled, effectively. I think we should admit it's over. The efforts to control Buckley, progeny, down to and including Citizens United. And even if we reverse Citizens United, we still have that fundamental problem. So if nothing is done, then the party structure becomes less relevant because I can form my own 527 and induce my own PAC. Indeed, I can even tell my PAC where my events are going to be. And I can mention my PAC at my campaign events. I just can't coordinate strategy with the campaign PAC. So that's absurd, is it not? Either that happens, in which case the party becomes unimportant because you can do it all on your own, or we pass the amendment that I've distributed to you, and we return elections to the people who you are representing for contributions and expenditure. And the party becomes less relevant there as well because you are focused on the people you represent from whom you derive the means to run for office. So I come to the conclusion of this third and last of my main topics, that we are witnessing the beginning of the end of party structures. California has already done that by going to the top two. So our race for United States Senate is between two Democrats this time, and there will be similar examples in the years to come. That is our future, and I believe that it does not necessarily foretell a bad future. We should recognize it's coming. My last point is to encourage people of good conscience to run for office. And my departure point here is that no systemic change is a substitute for integrity. And no change will ever work if individuals running for office and serving in office are not honest and conscientious. How can we encourage good people to run? Well, first of all, we can all take steps to prevent people who run from office from suffering abuse. Loss of privacy. Some punishment for serving should not include having your family exposed to slander. How can we solve this? Well, the Markkula Center is actually part of the solution, and so I end with my specific recommendations under the great directorship of Kirk Hansen and the directorship of the government ethics application of Hana Callaghan. The Markkula Center could actually develop a good housekeeping seal. The good housekeeping seal would be available to candidates who behave themselves. And the absence would be observed for those who don't. And I think among the elements of the good housekeeping seal would be, does an incumbent use his or her government employees to help in their campaign? Footnote, this is almost as big a surprise as tithing, but it's true. Did you know that virtually, not all, but virtually all candidates for office who are incumbents find their government employees working their political events on their own time? I think that should be perceived as dishonorable, and that we should instead rule that if you don't, you get the Markkula Center Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. And when you go after somebody in a clearly erroneous way, not that the Markkula Center would be the fact checker in chief, but they can certainly do the egregious. So I can see the Good Housekeeping Seal for those candidates who follow the practices and those who are egregious getting the equivalent of a negative designation. So my first recommendation is let's take steps to prevent abuse of those who put themselves forward to run for office and of their families, and I think the Markkula Center fits here quite strongly. Lastly, thinking of who you might want to support, I'm going to say something a little surprising. Work for somebody who is willing to lose. The worst thing is not losing an election. The worst is telling yourself that a small compromise, just a small one, of what you know is right is okay because I'll get in office and then look at all the good I'll do once I'm in office. That is the real temptation. And I have great compassion for those who are raising a family on an elected official's salary. What do you do if you're being paid your salary as a member of Congress or state legislature or supervisor, and the issue comes up that's going to lose you the support of your party, that might cause you to be primaried with unlimited money coming in through one of these make-believe PACs, targeted to Democrats if you're a Democrat, Republican if you're a Republican, in your district, and that's your salary. And you're trying to save for children going to college, and you can't line up your next job while you're in office. That's the most obvious ethical conflict. So I have great compassion for them, and I will say without being specific in Congress, I saw a number of members of Congress vote contrary to what they knew was best. And I was not hectoring any of them, but I would occasionally ask, well, why did you vote for that? I mean, you and I thought pretty much the same, I thought. And they'd say, oh, I'd be primaried. And that's the fear, because then you're primaried, you lose, you're out of office, and you don't have a means of income. So my conclusion is that conscience is very seldom overtly overridden. Instead, the imagination of the human mind to rationalize is unconstrained. And I've heard that larger good argument many times in Congress. I never once let it overbear my specific judgment. And I think that's what you should find in an individual, even as important as where she or he stands on a particular issue. Ask, is this person willing to lose? Because this is a person whose conscience will direct their vote. And if you find that person, vote for her or vote for him. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have some microphones, and Tom is willing to take whatever questions you want to throw. Well, maybe not whatever questions, but most questions that you would like to ask of him. So let me invite you to do that. I will just recognize one thing, which is that indeed when we went to hire a director of government ethics a couple of years ago, we did a search, and guess who we ended up with? The campaign manager for Tom's statewide race, Hana Callaghan. Where are you, Hana?
Hey, Hana.
And she is taking us into the brave new world of trying to address the environment of campaigns and government today. So, thank you, Hana. So please,
Sure.
questions, and there are microphones. Here we go.
How do you think campaigning and campaign styles have changed in the digital age?
The 30-second attack has become predominant. For those who didn't hear the question, how has campaign and campaign styles changed in the digital age? The 30-second attack is dominant. Social media has allowed outlets for the 30-second attack that could never have been afforded in television, even with the cheaper time available on targeted cable TV. And so with the 30-second attack, the quote out of context, I'll give you one. I supported Jerry Parsky's tax commission reform proposal, which said, let's abolish the business tax in California and make up the deficit loss by expanding the sales tax to include services, accountants, doctors, lawyers, for example. Okay, I can be wrong on that, but I believe it's a reasonable point of view. My next election, I was attacked for proposing an increase in taxes on doctors, lawyers, and accountants. That's correct. It's just not true. Because the whole truth was, get rid of the business tax and put this in. So that's the danger. And I've seen it in 30-second ads just with increasing frequency. That's what's changed.
Hi. So you mentioned that you proposed to eliminate term limits for members of Congress, and so in regards to that, it makes sense, and one of the reasons you said was because it kind of disincentivizes members who want to vote contrary to their own personal beliefs to run. So could you describe, so the drawback to not having a term limit would be accountability to one's constituents, being abuse of power, being in that position for so long, I don't care now about what my constituents want, so I'm no longer really representing them and just my own beliefs. So how could we avoid that?
If you take my other suggestion along with it, I'm entitled, I think, to present a package, and you can only raise money from the people in your district, you got that solved. If you're ignoring your district and you cannot raise any money outside of your district and you can't contribute from your own pocket, you will quickly be out of office. The people will impose their own term limit on you. Yeah, I think it would be very beneficial if it were simultaneous, yes.
Although you didn't specifically address this tonight, it has to do with money, and that is, over the last 10 days, I think I received my sample ballot and my voter handbook, and if you put the two together, they're about as thick as the Bible. And what do you think of the whole proposition system? It seems to be so out of control these days, and if anything, the attack ads and the 30-second misleading ads are worse than it is when it comes to the candidates.
You're right about the proposition advertisements. It's as though I actually want to cause veterans to pay more for their pharmaceuticals, so therefore I will vote for this because I hate veterans. You'd have to embrace that thought if that's your only source of information was the attack ad. So a sensible reform, which has been proposed by others but which I heartily endorse, is after a number of signatures has been achieved so that your proposition is ready to go to the ballot or through the Attorney General who writes the summary, have a 30-day period where it lays before the legislature. So you'd have to back this up a few weeks, but it can be done. And during that 30-day period, the legislature has the opportunity to present the supporters of the initiative, and you have to designate who they are, with a legislative solution. And that's going to have some nuance and some compromise and have a little bit more careful thought, I would believe. And then you take it or leave it. You can roll the dice and lose that initiative, or this can go through the legislature. The people do elect their representatives to make laws. They respect the ability that comes from subject matter study. So that would be my solution. I wouldn't get rid of the initiative, but I would have this 30-day referral and see if we can't work something out that would obviate the need for you and me to read 35, 40 pages. I think the folks with the mics decide who gets to speak.
I have a mic, so I'll stand. Great to see you again, Tom.
See you again.
So this election, presidential election, the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, my goodness. I don't think either one of these candidates would win it. So I'm thinking to myself, we've gone down this path so far now, but wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a provision that both of the parties could, right now, come up with a different candidate? I mean, really, what can we do?
Well, thank you, Liz. It's a pleasure to see you again, too. Both parties have rules that allow for the replacement of their candidate for president in the case of disqualification, resignation, death. There is a phrase in the Republican rules, which I had occasion to look at, or otherwise. So there is some possibility of interpreting that the Republican National Committee or the Democratic National Committee, assuming they have the similar language, I'll ask Joe if it exists, I don't know, but I assume it does. It must. There's got to be some provision for a disqualification to take steps. But the disenfranchisement of all those who voted for the candidate who won is a very, very serious step, which very few people in elected office or political office would wish to undertake. So we come now with 3 weeks to go with candidates who have broken the record of unpopularity for our history of our country. I think since Blaine Cleveland, James G. Blaine and Grover Cleveland. That and Justice Lurton are going to be the takeaways from this presentation tonight. And I fear it's too late. I will say this, though, that without saying who, a letter to the editor of the Orange County Register was published on Sunday saying to the Republican nominee, won't you please, for the good of the country, let Governor Pence be the nominee? So I think there is some sentiment of that nature. But I'll have to say, Liz, and it would be the most remarkable party leader who would say, I'm going to go against the rules that led to this result. Nevertheless, I'm not breaking any news when I tell you I did go to the California Republican chairman and made that request.
I'm going to bring you back to the last answer. You suggested something about the Attorney General. Should the Attorney General no longer give the opinion on the initiative and propositions? Is that time over where you have an elected official who basically has enormous amount of pressure on them through various money, party issues, giving the opinion, which is supposed to be neutral, on the initiatives?
Yes. For those who don't. For those who don't focus on it, the law in California is you draft the initiative, you get the signatures, and then it goes to the Attorney General who prepares the summary. And many Californians only read the summary. And a classic example was an initiative that was proposed when I was working as Director of Finance to limit the future use of defined benefit pensions for public employees. If you don't know about this, you will when your taxes go up to pay for defined benefit packages that we put in and never should have had and never had the money for. So the idea was put it on the ballot, let's outlaw defined benefit pensions going forward. Title and summary came back. I'm quoting from memory, so I might not be perfect, but it's pretty close to this. Proposal to limit pensions for widows, widowers, and orphans of police officers killed in the line of duty. Right, sign me up for that. I'd like to So the danger is quite clear. So who should do it? I propose the state librarian. Am I right? Isn't it wonderful? Go up to Sacramento, look at the legislature building as you come up Capitol Mall, look to the right, and you'll see the state library. And there the state librarian lives waiting for the call to duty that I have now given.
I've read a couple of the state librarians' books. I don't know if you want to do that. I'm wondering your thoughts on the open primary system. One of the benefits ascribed to it was that it would be this moderating influence, and we wouldn't have, far right wing against far left wing. We might end up with two people from the same party, but they would be more likely to be centrist. What are your thoughts? Is that helping?
I believe it has. It's a bit too soon still, but I believe it has had that effect in California. Bear in mind, the open primary, the top two primary, did not apply to the president. Okay, so it did not apply to the president, but it did apply to the United States Senate, and so we have two Democrats running in the finals of the U.S. Senate. The idea was that you really can't go too off to the extreme if you know that the person who holds the middle can draw from both parties. Or more statistically speaking, if you believe the distribution of voters is a bell-shaped curve, you're going to limit the power of the tails by empowering the middle. And I think that's sensible. There was a slight variation. I supported the open primary in 1996, which passed and then was struck down by the Supreme Court, which said everybody can vote in the primary. You choose to vote for whoever you want, but there's still a Democrat and a Republican and a Libertarian and a Green in November. So the highest vote getter would go on to November, but you'd still have the parties. And I thought that was better. Because otherwise what you've done essentially is tell the Libertarians and the Greens and the Socialists and the other third parties, you're out of it. I don't think that's an attractive feature. Now, did it have the result of electing more centrist candidates in the legislature and in Congress? I think so, but it's a little bit hard to tell even now because you have so many legacies of people who are still in office. Certainly that's true for Congress. But I'll conclude by saying that in the year 2000, that 1996 law applied because the Supreme Court didn't strike it down until 2001. And I won the Republican primary for United States Senate in the year 2000 with the help of a ton of Democrats. And I lost the Republican primary in 1992 when it was closed, and I lost the Republican primary in 2010. So within the Campbell household, there is a consensus on that issue.
Maybe one more question. We have one more question that you'd like to raise? Please.
It seems to me that the parties really don't choose their candidates. If you could be an unaffiliated voter and then go down and register in Party X, and the next day file for the papers for president, has the party really chosen, and suppose that person goes on, has the party really chosen a candidate of their party?
The Supreme Court has actually spent some ink on this question. Is it okay for a party to say you must be a party member for a year or 2 or 6 months in order to guard against just what Barbara Wardenberg described, namely, I'm becoming a Democrat just for this purpose, and then I get the heck out of the party, or Republican appropriately. And the court said, whereas we understand the need for the parties to preserve that interest, there's also the constitutional right to travel between states. And so if you're like me, an immigrant to California from the state of Illinois, and I'm told you can't register for 2 years, I think that's a little bit overdoing it. And roughly speaking, the Supreme Court came down and said 6 months. So it's available to us if we wish to say you must register 6 months in advance, when that shows a certain amount of farsightedness and perhaps a little bit more commitment than simply the opportunity of the moment. Well, I think it would apply to both. You're quite correct to ask because the Supreme Court was dealing with the question of voting. But if a party is permitted to say you cannot vote in our primary unless you've been a member of the party for 6 months, and the Supreme Court has upheld that, I think it's fairly clear the Supreme Court would also say you cannot run with an R after your name unless you've been a member of that party for 6 months, or a D. So that would be my guess, but I'm extrapolating for what the Supreme Court has said. Putting it this way, though, all told, there was a lot of opposition to the top 2 primary and the open primary, the two not being the same for the reason I distinguished, by saying, well, you know, the Democrats will vote for the weakest possible Republican, and the Republicans will vote for the weakest possible Democrat. And I'm not saying that never happened, but the evidence is vanishingly small that it did, as opposed to the empowerment of individuals in the middle. So if you believe that bell-shaped curve exists, I think it's worth the experiment.
Let me thank Tom on behalf of the Markkula
Thank you very
Center
much.
and our audience.
Thank you so much. Thank you.